Hey everybody, welcome to the I303 podcast, where we talk about ingenious insights and oddball opinions from the perspective of an IO. Today I have Nic Baldwin with me, and we're going to be talking about IO as it relates to pop culture. So with that said, Nic, if you wouldn't mind sharing with the listeners a little bit about your origin story.
Sure. Like a lot of people, I think, at least of my generation, I didn't know what IO psychology was until a little bit later in the game. I actually had done some internships in high school and put myself in a position where I was interested in neuroscience going into undergrad. So my first year or so in college was that, and I really enjoyed the nitty gritty, the rigor of that kind of science. But it was a bit distant to be thinking about feeding amphetamines to a mother pup rat and then seeing how it affected their pup rats and
Yeah.
like how's that actually matter for a human being I might see in the world. So I kind of moved away from that. And at that time, somewhere around there, a mentor and a friend of the family at Bowling Green State University, where I did my undergrad, by the name of Dr. Mike Zicker. He was the first one to sort of be like, hey, like, with that description and you change into psychology, maybe you want to look into IO. It's a bit of the rigor, but has a little bit more of the touch of finding things. And so from there, I started taking a couple of IO classes in undergrad. And by the time I was, finishing, I think my junior year, I was relatively confident that I was going to be looking for graduate programs in that. And so I applied, ended up at Roosevelt University in Chicago. And I have not left Chicago since. So that became kind of my point. Found my wife here, went on to do my PhD at Roosevelt University. And then after I finished my coursework for a PhD, I also taught for 5 years as a full-time faculty member there and was the program director for that same master's program that I started in for a while, which is where I really started to let myself lean into pop culture in IO psychology because I would use examples from classes. The one we all talk about, Office Space, but then I really
Yeah.
liked finding the ones that were a little bit more out there. The summer of 2020, I did a program called that I tried to do my best to sort of promote, just called IO Summer Movie Nights. I think like a lot of people at that time, I was looking for any outlet and we couldn't be really in the same spaces together. So I was sharing movies over a Discord, and then we would have anywhere from 12 to I think one time we had like close to 50 people all in a Discord chat having conversation about these different movies and about where IO is intersecting with them. So I think the fun thing about IO within TV, movies, etc., that I like to talk about is the idea that we all work, therefore like we all interact with it. And so any movie, TV show that shows, two people interacting, especially at work, but really even two people interacting, has concepts that we learn about in IO psychology that can be of interest to explore. So that's a bit of my background.
Yeah, so when it comes to IO, a misconception that people often get is it's a psychologist in the workplace that you go to for counseling. And it's like, well, we have a different perspective when it comes to psychology in the workplace. To your point, it's when individuals interact and what that dynamic looks like between individuals. So, with that said, when it comes to IO and pop culture, it sounds as though you've had an opportunity to lead or engage a broad variety of individuals in that space. Out of all the movies or TV shows you've had a chance to share, which one, two, or three would you say best encapsulate or best represent what the field of IO can do or its application within the particular item itself?
That is such a great question. That is such a great question. Um, I think in terms of what the field is like to me all about,
Yeah,
and I think we talked about this offline before, David, Moneyball is one that comes
yeah,
to
yeah.
mind in terms of the sort of methodological rigor, there being statistics, you having your best predictive validity of how a person is going to perform, and you do it in an objective way as possible. And it's the whole idea of past performance being indicative of future performance, and just all of that is captured really well in Moneyball. And I think a lot of the while baseball and some other sports films maybe or sports themselves like hold on to these gut feeling
Yeah.
types of ways, people a lot of times I think younger than me forget like that's how most jobs
Yeah.
have been hired throughout history is just like, I got a feeling about this guy, and
Yeah.
it's IO psychology that came in and said, we could do this better. We could do this better.
Yep.
So that's definitely one. I struggle. I think I'd probably pick Clerks as
Okay.
another. I
Yeah.
think it represents a number of topics. Clerks, I think people, whether they think about it or not, like it's got that hourly work. It has a lot of CWBs. It actually has OCBs. The whole concept of, I'm not even supposed to be here today. If people are familiar
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Clerks, like that's an OCB, right? That guy came in, and you get to see in that characterization the pros and the cons of that. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? And I think that that gets to be explored in a way that is not as pro management as a lot of, I think, both our field and movies tend to be.
Yeah. Quick question,
Yeah.
Nick. What's an OCB for those who are not familiar with the term? And what is, I believe, a CWB? Is
Yes.
that
Yes. See,
okay?
us IOs, we slip into
Yeah.
them with
Yeah.
acronyms
Yeah.
without even thinking about it. Yes. So a CWB is a counterproductive work behavior. So these are your things like stealing from work, or in the
Mm,
case of Clerks, you've got a character who's kind of berating customers at times, or is not really trying very hard. And an OCB is an organizational citizenship behavior. David, I'm so glad you stopped me for these
yeah.
things. I,
Yeah.
I ramble on. And so an OCB is kind of seen as like, anything that a person is doing that is technically above and beyond their job description, but is, still good for the organization, right? So it's being good organizational citizen. I will put a pin in the research that tends to
Yeah.
use OCB as a criterion for performance because it's by my definition not supposed to be, but
Yeah.
some people
Yeah.
like to use it that way too.
Yeah. So going back to Moneyball, one of the things, well, for those who haven't seen the movie, would you mind providing like a quick synopsis in terms of what it is and what the movie is about?
Sure, I'd love to. So it's, I think, a very well written film, and it's a very well acted and performed film. You've got Brad Pitt is sort of our main character. He is the down and out manager of, I think it's the Oakland A's,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly. Yeah, okay. It's
Soon to be Las Vegas A's, but yes.
oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, congrats. So the soon to be Las Vegas A's is towards the bottom of the pack.
Yeah.
And some people who are not sports people, I did not know this, for example, when I was first watching the movie, how good your team is also impacts how many dollars you have to be able to buy people. And obviously, you have to kind of buy people's contracts and you're trading players. So when you're not a well-performing team, you don't have a ton of money to then get good performers, right? And
Yeah.
so that team continued to do poorly and more poorly and more poorly. They were still recruiting people by the traditional, like, let's find the stars out there. Let's find the guy that's got, the it factor. He's going to be the single player.
Yeah.
And this character that Brad Pitt plays interacts with a statistician from an Ivy League school who points out to him, and has been tracking statistics for a while, and the realization that, like, really more than maybe some other sports, even
Yeah.
baseball is not actually all about the stars and the individuals. The star and the individual can only have so much impact. One
Yeah.
of the things I like about Moneyball is it takes also, without getting too deep into the statistics, it talks about the ways in which the team members and the individual roles within a given team complement each other. So it's that understanding of, like, what is the ultimate goal for this team to do, not just can this one person perform on getting hits, for example. And so that person, Brad Pitt's character, takes that, runs it on its head, and then to rush to the end of the story, they have a banner season. They've got the best
Yeah.
season they've ever had, more wins. I think they broke the record for winning
Yeah.
streaks at the time. And fun fact, then he gets approached to continue to do his work at Boston Red Sox. And for people who are fans
Yeah.
and all track things, this was about a year or two before the Boston Red Sox then took that exact same plan and broke the curse of the Bambino,
Yeah.
so to speak,
Yeah.
and had their fever pitch and won the World Series. So, that strategy plus
Yeah.
extra money, like the Red Sox have, gets you the most winning team, and that's really kind of where it all comes together.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you picked Moneyball as the first one because I think that is the perfect example of where and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, where I potentially see the world of work. So from Moneyball back into the world of work, and then we'll go back to Moneyball. So what I like about Moneyball, to your point, is they were able to break down not just from a scouting or recruiter perspective, do I like this person? Is this person a good player? It's breaking it down by the skills.
Yeah.
So that in IO is what we identify as a job analysis, where we're looking at what are the skills necessary to be successful, not just do I like this person, do I have that gut feeling. So, transitioning that into the workplace, I think with the advent of I think more and more organizations, and I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this, so feel free to jump in, whenever you want to. More and more organizations are going to move away from looking at roles, looking at job families, and they're going to start looking more at skills and looking at how this group of individuals brings together the skills rather than the roles or the individuals themselves. So I think organizations are going to look at identifying those skills and then clump those together, just like the Oakland A's did in Moneyball. What are your thoughts there?
So I do think that there has
Yeah.
been very much a push towards skills-based hiring.
Hmm.
That's a like sort
Yep.
of hot button word these days, both with I think in the literature and
Yeah.
within the more practiced side of things of IO psychology. I will say I don't think we will move it there as quickly as some of us IOs might like. And the
Yeah.
only reason for that is it is actually very difficult, even with tools like AI, to effectively capture and accurately
Yeah.
predict performance or skills, like knowing what the skills are for a
Yeah.
specific job.
Yeah.
Um, but having said that, if you take a more competency model approach too, and you kind of look at things from that skills perspective, and you know that maybe there are certain core skills that you want, because maybe you want like a flexible or an agile workforce, for example,
Yeah.
right? Like, and you want people to move around. Well, maybe that means that there are certain abilities everyone has to have, right? And so that's as long as you're doing that at that scale, it gives you then suddenly that ability to potentially have that capacity of capturing those skills. I do think AI will have a chance to help us if in the fact that as we identify these measures of skills, and especially if there's some sort of a fidelity job performance, I think AI is giving us abilities to analyze data in ways and especially at speeds that
Yeah.
we've never really been able to do before. We can use AI now to, for example, once it's something taught, once we tell it what to look for, we can have it capturing certain behaviors, we can have it capturing micro behaviors, and then more importantly, we can sort of input information from five different people, for example, and the AI can be spitting out, stuff, especially because the term AI gets used for a lot of things,
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
But I think my only fear with AI, like I think I'm someone who's mostly very bullish on AI. Like I'm positive. I think it's a great thing. I think it has opportunity to retrofit a lot of things. There's I guess two fears. One is the specific to IO fear of too many people adopting it too quickly without it being properly vetted and
Hmm.
without people understanding, the fact that it's still taught on something. I think a lot of business people, a lot of CEOs, a lot of MBA types that don't have the
Yeah.
statistics knowledge that an IO does, they see it as, oh, it's this magical thing and it's totally objective because it's a robot. Theoretically, the decisions it's making, in that one instance doesn't involve a single human who is biased in a way that you can see. However, when it's trained on past data, it's that data that it came from is still dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens or hundreds of thousands of people who all have their own biases.
Yeah.
And then depending upon your data set, you might be instead sort of hyper activating that said bias. And there's tons of examples of that with where AI has been sort of put into place without it being
Yeah.
vetted. It's like when you don't think about asking the AI how it's coming to its conclusions, and you just say, okay, predict who's more likely to have recidivism, for example, with prisons, right? And they end up being like, well, this particular zip code seems to do that,
Yeah.
and that particular zip code is maybe, also 99% correlated with particular
Yeah.
race, for example. It's like, well,
That's a problem.
While that might be
Yeah,
true, you know what I mean? It's
yeah.
like we still have to be thinking about what are the predictors, adverse impact, things like that. So
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think as IOs we need to be more, I don't want to say aggressive, but more at the table when it comes to how best to leverage AI. Because to your
mm,
point, if we're not at the table, people will just accept the data that they're getting and just go with it without having a second thought to say, okay, is there any issue here? So I'm glad you pointed that out.
yeah, and that's something I actually think we very much as a science,
I
as a
think so
whole,
too.
a field, need to be comfortable stepping in, because there are people who are more than happy to do it in our absence.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and they're yeah, I don't know that they have the same ethics training. I know that they don't have the same statistics training. This is a tangent, but I can recall at the last PSYOP, due to some changes and things with government and whatnot, I ended up having a sit down conversation where I was trying to talk to one of the people who lobbies on the behalf of PSYOP as a society to Congress. And he
Real quick, Nick,
articulated,
let me interrupt. What
yeah.
is PSYOP for those who may not be familiar? Yeah,
Love David. Yes, this is
yeah,
where you're at. So
yeah.
PSYOP, for those who don't know, stands for Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychologists. So
Okay.
SIOP. The IOs here that we keep referring to,
Yeah.
that's our premier organization. There are others that lots of people get a part of, but PSYOP pretty much, if you consider yourself an IO, you're probably a member of it. And then the other thing I did there is I just referred to PSYOP as like the conference, and as if those two things were the same. No, the society is its own thing. The
Yeah.
conference is technically just a conference from the society. While I was there, I was having a conversation with somebody who lobbies on the behalf of PSYOP to Congress to try to make sure that Congress hears, the concerns of IO psychologists, make sure that they're considering the science, make sure our science gets more visibility, etc. That individual said, he regularly, and this was someone who was a lawyer, like, that by training, and he regularly is in meetings with some of the top, most intelligent IO psychologist scientists, like people that are, our writing our seminal articles and names that anybody who's in an IO program knows. They get into meetings with, Congress people or what have you, and they're being asked questions. And we, as a field, he said, more than any other field, and he helps with other fields, he helps with other sciences. He said, more than
Yeah.
any other field, he feels IO psychologists have a tendency to back away and they have a tendency to pull back and be afraid to say. And I think it comes from our humility and it comes from our awareness that, like, our field within psychology is huge in
Yeah.
terms of what it covers. IO is still pretty darn big. And so the average IO psychologist, especially as an academic, is like, I did my dissertation and I've done lots of studies on this one particular
Yeah.
topic. Maybe it's OCBs, for example, right? And I'm
Yeah.
like, I know OCBs. And anything else, I am not willing to speak as if I'm an authority on.
Yeah.
But the problem that this guy's pointing out is like, okay, but in this room right now, let's say we're talking about team dynamics instead of OCBs. In terms of the science of team dynamics, you are still the most expert person. Like, just because it's not tons of studies you've done, you're well more versed than anybody here, and you should speak up and you should speak with authority to that. So that's a tangent. I just think as a science, we could do a lot better with it.
No, I'm glad you pointed that out because I think one, not only does it apply to IO psychology, but I think it applies to other social sciences where because technically, and I'm gonna go a little bit on a tangent and I'm gonna push the edges a little bit. So feel free to let me know, if I'm going a little little off the rails here.
I
But
think
I
I know where you're
think
going, so I'm following you. Go
yeah.
ahead.
So as, an IO psychologist and the social sciences in general, I think we're reluctant to step outside of our realm because our science is not quote unquote a hard science, meaning
Exactly.
there's still a little bit of wiggle room. And so we're reluctant or we're hesitant to step out because even within our own particular domain, it's inconsistent or it can be inconsistent over time. Whereas I look at somebody like a Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's an astrophysicist, but he's comfortable talking about all other forms of kind of the physical sciences because more often than not, there's typically one right answer. Whereas in the softer sciences, that's not always the case. What do you think about that?
I love Neil deGrasse Tyson as an
Yeah,
example, especially because I've seen enough things, and he's become such a sort of popular character, an appearance on podcasts and things. So people start asking him questions that don't actually have anything to do with
exactly.
these kinds. They start asking him social science questions. What I love about Neil deGrasse Tyson, and this is something I agree is what IOs or other sciences could do. We still take a scientific approach, and not to throw any other branches of IO psych or of psychology under the bus. Something like a clinical psychologist is a very different focus. They're not focused on large groups. They're not focused on the aggregate. They're not focused on your average human. They're not focused on trying to predict the most likely thing that any given person I pulled off the street would do.
Yeah.
They are focused on what is this one person in front of me going to do, and what can I do to help them to do whatever it is better and better for themselves, right? So that's a little bit less science just because of the nature of like you read the science, but you're not necessarily performing. You know, in fact, it'd be ethically questionable at times to be like, I'm going to use this one person and I'm going to,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Apply
run
to everybody.
experiments with them.
Yeah.
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 So yeah, no, it's a good thing that those things are different, but I think that IO psychology has that scientific basis in the way that Neil deGrasse Tyson answers a question that's not his field. He will identify briefly, you know, what his limitations are and what he does or does not know, and then he will immediately just launch into, well, here's how I would approach that question as a scientist. And I think we can do that. And I think that
Yeah.
that's something that, yeah, we have that skill set as much as anybody else does in the hard sciences as well.
Gotcha. All right. So now bringing it back to pop culture and to the two examples you shared. So with Moneyball, I like how we're able to use that as a way to identify the skills. And I really like how you pointed out within baseball, there's only a limited number of skills we can evaluate. Whereas in work, there's almost an unlimited number of
Mm.
skills we can evaluate. So I like how you brought up the idea of potentially consolidating those into competencies, leaving them a little bit squishier. So that way it's not this specific skill, but maybe this grouping of skills that individuals can leverage as they move up, down, left, right, diagonally within an organization. So I think to your point, Moneyball does a good job of identifying how identifying the skills needed to be successful can make someone successful in the workplace if we focus on those during the hiring or selection process. I also like how in Clerks, you also included it's not just the skills, but it's those other characteristics as well, whether it is organizational citizenship behaviors going above and beyond the job description, or those counterproductive work behaviors, basically working with an a-hole. So I think those two are a good combination in terms of what skills IO can bring and what those look like in the real world or in pop culture. So before we jumped on this call, you were speaking my language. So one of my favorite movies is, of course, Maverick, Top Gun Maverick. I actually thought part two was surprisingly really well. But you touched upon how within Top Gun Maverick, there are some IO concepts that are also coming to life. So speak my language, speak to my heart, talk to me, Goose. What were you seeing in that movie?
Yeah, so for one thing, I think there's a really great safe high fidelity training example. So one
Okay.
of the things IO psychologists also do is, you know, we study training and how do you then therefore get a person up to a level of performance, knowing what their competencies are and what have you coming in. So in that example, you've sort of got this selection piece that leads into a training piece that leads into a selection piece as well, which is how a lot of military examples do tend to go. Uh, so, you know, you, for whatever branch of the military, may end up with a selection test that you have to take that's a battery assessment. It's maybe looking at personality, it's looking at cognitive ability, it's looking at different psychomotor tests. You have to meet certain standards to even get into training. And then you would go on, learn a bunch of things, and they teach you a bunch of skills for whatever your job's going to be. And then, you know, you go on to the next stage, and before you're going to be getting additional ranks or additional specific postings, you know, there might be further selection that takes place. Top Gun Maverick is an excellent example of like,
Yeah.
and both Top Gun movies are this, like,
Yeah.
we're already
So
far into the
real quick,
group.
Nick, are you a bigger fan of the first one or the second one? Or are they
Oh
both on the
gosh.
even?
You know, I'm gonna say I'm a bigger fan of the second,
Okay, okay.
mostly because it's newer. I think it's just, you know, sleeker. It's kind of like The Force Awakens for Star Wars. It's like,
Okay.
you know, we basically did the same thing that the original A New
Yeah.
Hope did. We just kind of put some new people on it. We put a newer, you know, polish on it. We put some nicer, newer looking film things on it. And God, the cinematography in Top Gun Maverick is just chef's kiss. Just mwah, you
There you
know.
go. Yeah.
The fact that they shot those things in cockpit, for example, so amazing. I also do think I get a better grasp of the IO concepts
Yeah.
in uh, Top Gun Maverick, the sequel specifically, because of this piece, like all of its training, but like in Top Gun the original, the original movie, it's kind of just like, ah, we're gonna train you to be really good pilots, and we're gonna train you to be quote unquote dog fighters, right? And that's kind of the overarching. You still have the not really seen in advance of, but the idea of like these are already the top dogs, right? These are the
Yeah.
top people. Like that before you even get into Top Gun school, you already have to be, above the rest. Then you get here, then we're going to train you on something. The thing is, in the first one, it's like we're training you to just dogfight, and they kind of never really stop to explain what dogfighting is. In Top Gun Maverick, they've also done a really great breakdown of the task at hand, of the job that needs to be
Hmm.
done. And if you're an IO psychologist, you can then see what we would call a task analysis, which is one way to approach looking at jobs. And they have broken down all of that training, right? And they're making them run through the simulation. They're running actual planes, but they're like, hey, you're going to be running through this, and it's going to be actual mountains, but we know how high those mountains are, so we're going to track that instead. But it is every little bit, whether it's the fast run up through the trenches, the sharp turn up the mountain, the inverted way that you have to be there, the difficulty of launching the bomb in exactly the right way, right? This breakdown of that. And then so we've got this, they had to be Top Guns to begin with. Then they were, in this case of Maverick, they were people who'd already graduated Top Gun school. So they're top of the top of the top, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then we're like, we're going to train them, and it's this very specific thing. Lots of great task analysis happening, and then even then, there's this last bit of selection, and there's to some degree some more fuzzy things that happen there, thinking about team dynamics and who would fit better with who. You've got the hot shot guy who kind of
Yeah.
gets kept off the Iceman equivalent. Because he's kind of willing to let his partners and his friends die. And then there's also, and this gets it to like another whole other thing, you've got the admiral or whoever it is that's running Top Gun school, and then you've got Maverick, and they have differing opinions on what the sort of competencies, the
Yeah.
qualifications should be for that last tier, right? The guy who's the one running the school, he's like, hey, we got to get this mission done, and that's it. If that means we lose a couple of pilots, it's never actually said, but it's kind of implied. Whereas Maverick's like, no, that's not
Hmm.
an option. And I'm putting together a team that's going to, care about that sort of thing. So it's all of that put into one. And I guess that'd be the reason I would pick it over the first.
Yeah. So I like you. It's almost like a Top Gun and Top Gun Maverick. So in Top Gun Maverick, it almost got like a facelift, almost like
Sure.
excuse the rough around the edges, almost like a BBL, where it's like, here's the original. We're just gonna make it a little bit
Now,
nicer, a
now,
little bit more
David, I'm
modern.
gonna
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop you for a moment. You've made me
Do I
explain
have
what
to?
my acronyms are. I think you need to explain to the listeners what a
Ugh, okay.
BBL is.
So I don't think this has ever come up in any IO conversation I've ever had, but let's do it. Here we go. So a BBL, I can't believe I'm saying this. A BBL, for those who don't know what it is, it's short for Brazilian butt lift. And so
Uh-huh.
it's for more often than not, it's for women who want to tighten up their rear end a little bit. They rearrange their fat stores in their body into one particular area, their bottom. And so this often happens in Brazil. And then that's why you see, those women that have attractive bottoms. And so, yeah, that's a BBL.
I'm so glad I made you
Yeah,
stop to
it's
do
like,
that. Okay,
so we
continue,
have
David.
this has never happened to me. OCW or OCBs, CWBs, BBLs. I've never in my life strung those those acronyms together. So where I was going with Top Gun Maverick, what I really like that you pointed out is they were engaging in a training and had individuals actually live out and perform what was expected of them. So what they didn't do is sit down with each individual pilot and interview them. In that
Mm-hmm.
case, that would not have been the most appropriate selection process in making sure the right pilot gets to be a part of this program. Interestingly enough, I don't think that happens enough in the work world, where there are alternative options we have in developing an assessment and developing this protocol to either hire, promote, or train individuals rather than an interview. There are alternative options that we have. So I really like how you pointed that out. They could have just interviewed the hangman. They could have just interviewed, Goose's son. What was it? Rooster? Was that his name?
I think
Rooster?
so. Yeah, Rooster. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, yeah.
So they could have interviewed them, but instead they chose, we're going to actually have you run the route and see who can perform to what's expected. So I really like that you pointed that out.
Yeah, and in our parlance of the science of biopsychology, we would call that a high fidelity
There you go.
assessment, and you do see that in some. You tend to only see it in like really high important positions. But I'm with you, and I think that we need to do it more. I think that, another people might describe it as a work sample.
Yeah.
If you've ever applied for a job and it's maybe a job that requires, I remember my first internship as an IO, I had to like do something in Excel because we'd be doing things in Excel for data, and that's a work sample. And I think that more of those do need to be performed. I think the problem is that it always goes back to like it takes time to develop those things. You know what I mean? It takes time to know what exactly that job is and how can you capture it. So people always default to the interview.
Gotcha. Yeah, definitely. And so talk to me a little bit about Marvel and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There, I think leadership, team dynamics, both of which are heavy within the IO world, also came to life. Curious to hear your thoughts, curious to hear your perspective in terms of how that universe, those, group of movies, how they did in terms of showing IO principles.
Yeah, so I would encourage you to have on some co-authors and friends of mine, Dr. Sai Islam and Dr. Gordon Schmidt. They have written an entire book on the
Okay.
leadership aspect specifically. Marvel Cinematic Universe has a lot of great examples, kind of across it. And I think the one thing that's interesting about the MCU is you see differing types of leadership, right? So you've got your Captain America that's sort of that a bit of servant leadership. He sees his role as being there, for others and things of that nature. Versus your Tony Starks, who's, even when he kind of becomes a quote unquote good guy and he isn't being a warmonger anymore. He's still kind of like an abusive boss to some
Yeah.
degree.
Yeah.
And you see some of that play out as well. And then that's how you end up with things like Civil War with differing opinions. And then you've got, like later on, I think probably the best leader that I saw, and you only see glimpses of it, but I would say is probably Natalia Romanoff. You've got
Okay.
Black Widow. You see those little bits of things where she's kind of delegating things across the globe. You can see that she's keeping tabs on things. She's giving advice and bringing the team together for bigger things when they need to do it. But that sort of way of approaching things and recognizing the strengths of the team members that you have. I think Cap is another great one. I'd be more Team Cap than I would be Iron Man personally,
Yeah.
but I think he's such a perfect specimen that it's hard for him not to step into the fray and lead the charge when, I think it's good that a leader is willing to. It's not always good that a leader should if there's someone who'd be better for the task.
Yeah, I agree. And to your point, for me, I tend to align more with the way Captain America led rather than the way Iron Man led. Because to your point, I think Cap was more of a servant leader where he was trying to figure out, okay, how can I help my other teammates best realize their potential? What can I do to ensure they're doing their best? Whereas in Iron Man, I'm not sure if he to me, it always seemed to focus around him. It always seemed to
Hmm.
revolve around him. What's in it for me? I will say, with that said, his final in kind of the end game arc, his
Mm.
final move or his final, I don't even know what the word is, call, his final effort after he did the snap, that was like his ultimate sacrifice. But it's like, is it worth it if you're leaving dead bodies on on your final path to eventually get to that point? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that really is that just goes to show the great storytelling in the arcs because you've got that sort of happens in the first Avengers movie where Tony steps up to be, the guy who takes the fall. Um, but even then he's like traumatized from it, right? And then it's almost like that healing from the trauma and the comfort and the realization that it's still the right thing to do. Yeah, but it's like he's got to learn that lesson more than once.
Yeah. So going back to the idea of, doing a work sample or doing some high fidelity assessments, not only does that take place in Top Gun Maverick, but I also find it takes place in really high stakes hiring where there are billions, if not billions of dollars on the line. So here's what I mean by that. Professional sports almost rely exclusively on performance-based hiring criteria, where if you're going to be a quarterback, they want to see if you could throw the ball. They want to see your footwork. They want to see how quick you sprint. The Columbine comes to mind. I know the same holds true for basketball. I know the same holds true for baseball. So my thinking is if it works for them in those kind of million-dollar, billion-dollar industries, it should work everywhere else. And then the question I have for you that I'm curious to get your thoughts on is why is it so hard for business owners or individuals kind of in the work world to make that connection? What's missing there? Why don't they do it?
So I think the largest thing is money. It's investment. I
Mm,
mean,
hmm.
you just said it, right? Those billion-dollar
Yeah,
companies, and
true.
yes, there's lots of money to be made on the lines, and that's why willing people are willing to invest in it. For better or worse, we live in a late stage capitalist society, and we must function within those parameters. Uh, but I do also think the other thing is that sports largely is easier for those kinds of task breakdowns, right? Like a lot of modern office jobs, especially, for example, which is where a lot of IO psychologists tend to focus. I have opinions about that as well, but
Yeah.
that is where we tend to focus. And when that's the case, the jobs are usually kind of fuzzy. Like once you get past, maybe you need to write an email okay, maybe you need to be able to respond to things okay. A lot of times our jobs shift and change, and what those things are can be a little bit harder and those softer, fuzzier things, right? Like you said, throwing a ball, like I can watch you throw a ball and I know
Yeah.
what watching you throw a ball is and how far you throw it and how like accurate you throw it. Like that's two parameters that I now have to measure your task on, right?
Yeah.
Versus, okay, now write me a good research paper. Okay, now instruct a good class for an entire semester of undergraduate college students. These things require a lot more complexity. And that's not to say that they can't be done, it's to say that they're more difficult. The other thing I think that happens that you articulated there with the NFL Combine is a great example. And one of these relates, so two more things. One of these relates back to Moneyball. Moneyball and football also great examples of we track a lot of those statistics across the entire board, and we therefore collect that data, and there's just lots of data to pull from to be able to know that you're accurately predicting what is the outcome that you need and what is the predictor that leads to said outcome, right? That's just not always possible in any job that changes on a regular basis. With the NFL Combine too, which is a good example, you remember that that's really actually, I think, how many teams are there? 12, 24?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I'm not a football fan. I'm a baseball fan. Dodgers all day.
So, however many teams there are in the NFL, right? The NFL Combine is the entire NFL.
Yeah.
So imagine if somehow you had, I don't know, the top consulting firms. You've got your Kinseys and your KPMGs and your Deloittes and your Aons. They all came together and they were going to all measure their future crop of
Yeah.
entering professionals at the same time. You pool resources and you get information in a way that would be very different from an individual organization, right? Instead, individual organizations are left to themselves. They have to figure it out in-house. So I think that's the two biggest limitations is data, changing jobs, and those two being one thing, and money. Money always being a big thing.
Gotcha. And so, yeah, switching gears a little bit here. So we talked about Moneyball, we talked about Clerks, we talked a little about Top Gun and Marvel. So it sounds as though IO and some of the best practices within IO are seeping into popular culture. But when I bring up that I have a background in IO and this is what I do, I still get the response of, what is that? I've never heard of it. What, are you diagnosing me in the workplace? It's like, no, not exactly. So although IO practices are percolating into pop culture, there's still that gap or there's still that our messaging is not getting across. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what can IO as a field be doing differently to help other individuals know this is what we do, this is where we come from, this is how you could benefit by learning a little bit more about us.
So I think both practitioners and especially academics could benefit from stepping down a little bit,
There
and
you go.
and letting
Talk
themselves
to me.
step outside of the
Yeah.
science, and pop culture being great examples of, people don't think of Anchorman and think of
Yeah.
leadership, reorganization, organizational development, sexual harassment, CWBs, competition, or equity theory.
Yeah.
But I can use that movie
Yeah.
to teach all of those concepts, right?
Yeah.
And like if I were to take scenes, or if you know the pieces of the movie, or we love Office Space because it's got the Bobs, it's got consulting, but it's also got like employee motivation, it's got ESOPs. I'd never known of employee stock options ESOPs until that movie,
Yeah.
so there are lots of things that I think we don't think of, and this is where I like off the cuff ones. So that's I mentioned we
Yeah.
talked about Clerks. I'm now pulling another one out. Listeners, apologies if I'm literally reading some of these from a list I generated for an article that I published with a co-author Joe Mazzola some years back, and is available online for people to make suggestions or to review for themselves. I'll provide that to David for show notes. But
Yeah.
you know, Super Troopers, this is like I think a lot of people don't even know the movie Super Troopers anymore. It's a crass comedy back in the day, right? And you've got leadership downsizing, motivation, CWBs, employee punishments, workplace ethics. Like there's so many of these things that I think we have focused on, to your point earlier, David, trying to prove ourselves as a legitimate science, that we're too afraid to sort of step in our power, to turn a phrase from other branches, and say, like, hey, we're comfortable knowing that we got some stuff and we're comfortable knowing that we're good scientists, so much so that we can now relate that to you without having to be talking about the highfalutin science. And instead, we can now talk about, like, what does that look like in day-to-day life? Um, maybe some of us are bigger, stats nerds like me, you know what
Yeah.
I mean? And we just struggle to relate those things to people. But I think a lot of us are maybe afraid to do so, even though we see those things out in the real world and out in pop culture.
Yeah, and to your point, I think for me, and this is some of the feedback I've gotten surprisingly, as an IO, is that others who are not in the field, they get the perception that we're know-it-alls. And I don't want to come off that way. I try not to come off that way, but I can kind of see where they're coming from. Where to your point, we try to reaffirm or continually establish that we are a science, we are scientific, we are rigorous, and we forget that, although we have that background and that skill set, we also need to find ways to, what's the word that I'm looking for, bridge the gap so that the everyday person can appreciate and welcome what we're bringing to the table. I'm just curious, have you gotten any of that feedback? Have you experienced any of that at all? Curious to hear your thoughts.
Curious, being feedback, in other words, meaning, am I ever been called a know-it-all, essentially? Because
For lack of a
because
better term.
the answer is yes.
Okay.
Without
Yeah.
any equivocation,
Yeah.
by friends, by family
Yeah.
members. My wife will be the first one in
Yeah.
line to tell you
Yeah.
that I've had to work on that. I've had to work on it with my students. I've got this nagging thing when I used to be a professor, and I would start eventually. Once I started to get more comfortable, I would just openly say, here's a flaw that I have. I
Yeah.
am going to talk to you at times where it sounds like I'm judging you or I'm saying I think you're stupid. I promise there's
Yeah.
nothing that you're going to do this semester that's going to make me think you're stupid. That's not possible. But I know that I do it anyway.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do it with my wife. I have to work on it with my kid.
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely have that. I was going to say, I can't say that I do this well. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not here saying like, oh, IO psychologists should follow my
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
I do think we have that tendency, and I think part of the reason for that is IO psychology kind of brings order to chaos. Workplaces and any groups of people working together is chaos, kind of by
Yeah.
its nature to some degree, and we try to make sense of that.
Yeah.
And that, comes with maybe a little bit of a chip on the shoulder. Like, hey, I'm making something make sense that doesn't make sense. So,
Yeah. And I remember early in my career when I first got out of graduate school and got my first quote unquote real job. I remember working with one of my coworkers who was, a little bit more seasoned. She had been there probably 10, 15 years. And we're always, me and a couple of other new hires that, were a part of my cohort, we were all kind of hired at the same time as part of a recruitment and selection team. And so we were developing assessments for hiring processes. And then one of my coworkers who was there did not have a background in IO. I believe she had an MPA, so a master's in public administration, which is
mhm.
basically like an MBA, but for the public sector. But so
Yep.
me and all these other new hires would talk about, best practices, high fidelity assessments, making sure they're, we're using behavior linked good rating scales as part of the interview process. And then she came up to us and just asked us, we would talk about this day, mid-morning, afternoon, and at night. This would be all that we talked about. And then my coworker, the experienced one, asked, "Do you ever turn it off?" And it's like, I had never considered that. I thought everyone was like this. And it's like, well, no. Some people are just regular people. They show up to work, they do what they're supposed to do, and then they clock out. Whereas us, it's almost like, I don't know, maybe it's because we're passionate about this field because we really enjoy it, but it's like it's hard for us to turn it off. Would you have similar experiences?
I mean, that's the whole reason I have an entire list of popular culture
Yeah.
examples, right? Like, because I'm watching movies. I go to see modern movies, and I turn to my wife and I'm like, "Did you notice the?" Like talk about
Yeah.
how it's
Yeah.
a fun example of one of these
Yeah.
IO concepts, and she's just like, "Dude, I was just watching the movie."
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Just enjoy
um, but
it.
that I can't. Like you said, I can't help it sometimes, and part of it's because that's the joy that I get out of it. But
Yeah. Cool. So we've talked about kind of a couple of different movies. Are there any that we haven't touched upon yet that you think, okay, I definitely wanted to be sure we talked about this because it does a great job at, displaying or showcasing this ideology, this process, this phenomenon within IO?
Great question. I think I'm gonna of this list, like I said, and I'm the reason I keep bringing it up is I'm always
Yeah.
looking to add to it, and there's
Yeah.
always movies I've not thought of. There are movies that have been added by other contributors that I'd never seen. So by all means, hopefully people will come back to it. But I think the one I'm gonna pick is actually 12 Angry Men because it's a
Okay.
movie that, like some others, you don't think of as an IO movie, right? Like it's not in a workplace at all. Well, not really, anyhow.
Yeah.
Uh, but it gets at some really cool group dynamics and how groups sort of that forming, storming, and norming, you know what I mean? When we learn those
Hmm.
things about how groups come together and the concept of emergent leadership, and that's not always necessarily the best leadership, but it is certainly a leadership that we get pretty good at identifying. And so when you're trying to explain to someone what emergent leadership is, for example, you can just say like, are you familiar with the movie 12 Angry Men, right? And there's been multiple iterations of it. There was a
Yeah.
play originally, like, so people largely are, and they know enough about it for me to then say like, okay, the guy who, was the one dude who dissented from let's put this guy in the chair, that's emergent leadership, and that's a great way, I think, is a great example that shows IO psychology is still there in the places you would not expect.
Gotcha. All right. So in trying to be truthful and in trying to live kind of, we can be people outside of IO, kind of a broad general question. When it comes to pop culture, do you have kind of a favorite genre, a favorite movie, a favorite, grouping of movies? Tell me more in terms of what you're interested in.
So it's ironic you just picked that because I know you can see my background and
Yeah.
see the
Yeah.
number of Star
Yeah.
Wars paraphernalia that I have behind me. And I had never thought about it until this exact moment, David.
Okay.
But yes, that is probably my top one. And it has rarely been something that I think about IO concepts in, and maybe there's something to that. Maybe it
Yeah.
allows me to detach and turn off my brain, and that's why I like it so much. So, but
Yep.
yeah, Star Wars has always got a special place in my heart. I think I have consumed every piece of visual audio media, whether it's animated or otherwise, when it comes to Star Wars. So
Okay.
that's my
And
big one.
so when it comes to Star Wars, I'm also a pretty big fan, although I don't, don't have as much Star Wars paraphernalia in my background. As you can see, it's nothing.
We got a
But
nice
so
calming white behind you. It's
there
good.
you go. So we have the original trilogy, kind of the mid trilogy, George Lucas's second grouping, and then we have the kind of the Abrams trilogy. Of
Okay,
those three groups, which one would you say is your favorite and why?
man, I
Is
mean,
it
you're
tough?
asking me
Which
to
one's your
spit.
favorite kid?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
kind of a little bit.
Yeah.
I only have one kid, so I don't know what that really would feel like. But
Yeah.
it's a close one. It's a close one, but I have to pick the original trilogy, 4 through 6. It's got Empire in there, which I think is
Yeah.
some of the best stuff ever. I think no shade thrown at the genius storyteller George Lucas, but I think the prequels maybe he didn't have enough collaborators to push back at him, right? Like by the time he made the prequels, he was George Lucas, the
Yeah.
creator of Star Wars. And I think it's easy to forget that if you read the history of like sort of those first three movies being made, there were a lot of other collaborators and other people that were directors on some of those others. Or the very first one, his wife at the time was the editor, and you'll hear people talk about like George's director's cut was almost unwatchable, and she's the one who
Yeah.
like totally reorganized things to turn it into what it was. So I think that's a great example too of like groups and as opposed to individuals. But that's why I say the original trilogy, even though it's a little bit dated. Now, in terms of if you were to ask me like what era, not
Yeah.
just the movies, but the
Okay.
era, I
Yeah.
gotta go prequels.
Okay.
And I think that so my son's name is Hayden, and that is
There you
a
go.
nod to Hayden
Yeah.
Christensen, who played Anakin. I think that man is an actually pretty good, pretty great actor. If you've seen him in some other things, and I think that he got short shrift because as much as George Lucas is a visionary storyteller, he's been said to maybe not be the best actors director. And so I think Hayden was a upcoming person who maybe could have gotten better tutelage from a different director early on in his career. But those movies and that iteration and the sort of glory of society, but how easy it is for society to slip into darkness.
Hmm.
And not even necessarily talking about prescient current events, just generally.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that's always a good thing to kind of keep one's eye on. So I think that's where I would go with it. And then I would say go watch Clone Wars, and you'll actually understand uh, Anakin Skywalker's turn. So
Gotcha. Yeah, because thinking back to the prequels, I thought it was kind of just sudden. Like one day, he's Anakin, and then boom, all of a sudden he's like, okay, I'm gonna be Darth Vader. It's like it seemed a lot happen for him to, slowly make that. So maybe that'll be on my to-do list to check out the Clone Wars.
yeah, that animated TV series is also a chef's kiss situation. It
Okay.
is so good. Some are obviously better than others. It's at an era of TV where you got to make like 20 plus.
Yeah.
Some are kind of clunkers. It starts off a little bit more
Okay.
like for young kids, but by the end, it is very real, very adult material. There's some stuff that's going to happen in Ahsoka that I'm excited for that's coming from that. But yeah, I agree with you. You watch just the movies and Hayden's performance and what you see from the storyline and the writing that was there is it's like he is just a petulant child who
Yeah.
seems
Yeah.
cranky and
Yeah.
because people said they didn't like him. It's like what? This is
Yeah.
not enough for the darkest turn and for you to become the galaxy's worst
Yeah.
person. No, no, no. So
Yeah.
the that series gives it a lot more depth.
Perfect. Because I was like, sand is not enough. I know it gets everywhere, but that is not enough to turn you to the dark side.
But it's so coarse, David.
There you go. Awesome. Well, Nick, I thought this was a great conversation. I appreciate you bridging the gap between pop culture and IO. For me, I'm now going to start paying much more closer attention into what I watch to see, okay, how does this bring to life some of our IO topics? And then how I can translate that to the everyday person. That way they're experiencing this, but it comes from the field of IO. So it was a great conversation. I thank you for being a part of this. And if individuals wanted to connect with you, where would you recommend they go?
Great question. So if you want to connect with me and you want to talk things IO psychology, the best place is probably LinkedIn. You can find me Nicholas Baldwin. I can't remember if LinkedIn is NIC is how I tend to spell my shorter name. So NIC Baldwin. That's where I would go for that. If you want to hear more about me talking movies, my wife and I actually have a podcast of intermittent release where we talk about movies and we talk about relationships and how movies maybe impact relationships. So that is called In Love with Movies. That's the whole sort of in love, comma, with movies. You can find us on pretty much all of your, typical podcasting platforms for that. And just want to say again, David, thank you. I always love
Yeah.
talking movies and I always love
Yeah.
talking IO psychology. So this was great.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll be sure to tag those in the show notes at the bottom. So again, thank you, Nick, and I'll talk to you next time.
Sounds good.